I couldn't very well be the host of Marketing Together without having on my good buddy James Carbary. Not just because he's my friend, not just because I spent 4 years on his team at Sweetfish. They're a B2B podcast production agency if you're not familiar with Sweetfish. But it's because he literally wrote this book, Content-Based Networking, which if you've never heard the term content-based networking before, it's the idea of creating content with your ideal buyers rather than just creating content for them. So it's very much in line with the mantra of this show, marketing together, marketing with the folks in your ideal audience rather than just marketing to them or at them. In this conversation, we talk a little bit about how the strategy of content-based networking evolved for Sweetfish over time, how they've gone from marketing together with lots of individuals that fit their buyer persona to more strategic relationships that still have that relationship building value, but also the value of getting their points of view in front of new audiences through fewer relationships. And then we round out the conversation. You'll want to stick around to the end, I promise, because we get into some specific tactics that you can use to build relationships with the people that you're marketing with. We get very tactical toward the end to give you a few small tweaks to build stronger relationships as you continue marketing together. Welcome back to Marketing Together. I'm your host, Logan Lyles, Head of Partnerships at Teamwork. I'm joined today by a good friend, founder of Sweetfish Media, James Carbary. James, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much, man. This is going to be super fun. Ready to dive in.
We've been on the mic several times together, but a bit of a hiatus in a little bit. So I'm excited to dive in. And we're going to be talking about how you and the team at Sweetfish, how marketing together has changed over the years. It started one way, it's evolved. But I think that there is this through line of marketing with people who sit in the buyer's seat that maybe you've never sat in, that Jared's talked about a good bit, but how that has evolved over the years. And so, I think that I hate to do kind of the chronological timeline thing of like, when did the company start? What do you do? How did you get to this point? But I think specifically how you started at Sweetfish and how you started marketing as a very early company is so applicable here. So for folks who haven't heard the story of how you came up with the concept of content-based networking and how that started, I'd love to start there and have you unpack that.
Yeah, so we started Sweetfish in 2015, and we were just a blog writing agency. So I had dabbled in some content marketing with a technology startup that I had tried to get off the ground. And so I had a partner that was building the technology, and I was trying to figure out how to market it, and stumbled into content marketing and realized, man, like creating content that brought your ideal buyers to you was way better than picking up a phone and cold calling people. And so I was drawn to content marketing really because of that. And then over that first year, we had our messaging was, I mean, it was awful. I mean, our positioning, I should say, was awful. If you were B2C, if you were B2B, if you were a home builder, or if you sold learning and development services, it didn't matter. We would work with you. And so over the course of that first year, there was one particular client that we started working with. They were like a what they call a church plant. It's essentially like a startup church in right outside of Houston, Texas. And our team loved creating content for these folks. We were writing like blog articles that were really like, they were like BuzzFeed style articles, but local. So think like 7 date night spots in Rosenberg, Texas, 8 things to do with your kids on the weekend in Rosenberg, Texas. And these articles were going viral locally because nobody else was writing content like that for Rosenberg residents. And so it was driving a good bit of attention and awareness for the church that we were doing this with. And so I had this thought. I was like, man, if we could do this for this church in Rosenberg, we could have a church in every city in America that we write this kind of content for. And so the entrepreneur in you is like, okay, how can I scale this? How can I do this? And I decided to start a podcast and just invite a bunch of church planners to be a guest on this show. We called the show Plant Better. And I reached out to, I think, like 45 or 50 different church planners and asked them to be a guest on the show. So I should say we reached out to 100 church planners and we ended up doing episodes with, I think, 45 or 50 of them. and I think we got like a 90% response rate or something crazy. But there were some people that responded and said, "Oh, yeah, reach back out to me later," and you'll learn why we didn't continue doing the show. But ultimately,
Yeah.
we figured out that this was a brilliant way to build relationships with a market that we knew nothing about. I didn't know the first thing about church planning. And so we started the show, started building all these relationships, and through those relationships, ultimately found out that our client that we were doing this work for was a bit of an anomaly. They were funded by somebody in the pastor's family, heavily funded by somebody in the pastor's family. So they had access to dollars that most church plants don't have access to, and so it just wasn't a high priority, we found, for these kind of startup churches to invest in content marketing, and that was what we did. So we figured out in pretty short order, hey, this isn't going to work. But what we did learn from that was this is a brilliant tactic for B2B companies to build relationships with the exact people that they can do business with. And so I ended up writing a book called Content-Based Networking that really outlines this concept of content collaboration as relationship building. And I talk a lot in the book about the power of being able to build a relationship with essentially anybody that you want to build a relationship with by going to them and adding value first, by saying, "Hey, I want to create content with you. I want to feature you in some content that I'm creating, and I want you to be the star of the show," essentially. And so, sans Bill Gates and The Rock and the heavy hitters, most people that are in your market, depending on who you sell to, a lot of people are going to say yes. And this, keep in mind, this was back in 2015, 2016. So that it's a little bit played out at this point. Like you have to be really thoughtful in the outreach. You have to have a really compelling reason why you want to collaborate with them on a piece of content now, because more and more people have adopted this and are starting to do it. It was pretty intuitive to me at the time, and I think it's been intuitive to a lot of other people, in addition to the people that have read the book and heard us talking about it for half a decade.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, I've got my copy of the book right here. I remember being intrigued by the idea as I heard you start to talk about it on LinkedIn, and then I end up being featured in the book because I join as the first sales hire at Sweetfish and start executing on this strategy. For a B2B company, that being Sweetfish, the podcast agency at that point. And then, the evolution there, I think that's interesting that you and I had talked about a ton, right? The way that you started to take that same approach to content-based networking, which is creating content with your ideal buyers rather than just for them. Same thing we've been talking about in this show, marketing with the people in the market that you're trying to serve, not just marketing to them. So I think different words, same exact message, right? And so we started doing that at Sweetfish with the daily show, B2B Growth, that's still going and has evolved. And we're going to talk about that evolution as we continue the conversation here. But you and I said, well, hey, we're executing on this strategy of content-based networking. And we looked up and we were like, oh, we built an audience by accident. The podcast had grown and hit 1, then 2 million total lifetime downloads. Forget where it's at today, more than that. You and I started to build followings on LinkedIn. And I don't think that would have happened had we not been creating content with our prospects and with our buyers, because we were doing it for the relationship building, but it actually made our marketing better. And we can talk about, how it's evolved since then, but what else would you, say about that and like kind of that surprise of making the marketing better?
I would say that it also, I would also say that it gave. I can't speak for you here because I think you knew more about marketing coming into this than I did, but I knew diddly squat about marketing when I started B2B Growth. Literally diddly squat. I remember doing an episode with Anthony Canada, and this was probably 175 episodes in, because the first 150 episodes we thought sales leaders were going to be our buyers, and so the first 150 episodes were with VPs of sales, and I'm dense enough. It took me 150 episodes to figure out that VPs of sales aren't going to buy podcasting services. But this was back when nobody was selling podcasting services, and I was like, oh, it's a relationship play. Anyway, I was wrong. I'm wrong a lot. But I remember talking to Anthony Canada, and he was talking about this thing called category creation. because he was doing it at Gainsight with the customer success category. And I had no idea what the heck this guy was talking about. I was like, creating a cat, what? And I need to go back and listen to the episode because I probably sounded like an absolute buffoon. But the reality is I didn't know any of the buzzwords. I didn't know what half the acronyms meant. But I was stacking up relationships with the exact people that I knew ultimately could buy Sweetfish's services. And through these, what ended up becoming thousands of conversations, you end up learning a thing or two. And so it informed a lot of our points of view. And where we sit today, we actually are in a position to have our own thoughts that we're attempting to influence our market with, because we used B2B growth as a mechanism to actually understand our market better and learn alongside them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really threefold, right? Because you talked about that first execution of content-based networking when Sweetfish was a blog writing shop, building relationships with church planners, and then shifting to B2B sales leaders and then marketers through B2B growth. It was the focus on the relationship. But then you look up and you're like, oh, we've actually created at least decent content that was better than what we would have created just doing the typical content marketing play of like, oh, what's the best content out here? Let's hire someone to write it a little bit better, right? And that's where you get the copy and paste. And that's where I think marketing together makes your content better. But then third, it educates you faster on the market, right? And helps you refine your points of view. And so I think that leads us into kind of the evolution of what marketing together has looked like at Sweetfish. To set the stage for that, tell us a little bit about, the positioning now of Sweetfish. And it's a lot of what you and Dan and the team have been talking about in a media brand strategy. And we can talk about how marketing together plays into that today. But for folks who maybe haven't been following your content, what do you mean by this? What is the thing that you guys are beating the drum on? And then we can talk about how marketing together is playing into that.
So we talk a lot about the 3 content marketing motions. And so we know that content marketing is evolving. It's not just the same playbook that worked 10 years ago. There's different forms of content marketing. And so the way we bucket it, we say that you've got your corporate brand. So, if you're HubSpot, that's the HubSpot content. It's the content that they rank for in Google, and it's the content that has the most to do with their actual product.
Yeah, their live event, inbound, and the other motions, they're under the HubSpot brand.
And then you've got the personal brand. And so you've got Dharmesh over at HubSpot, that you've got Brian Halligan, their CEO. You've got a lot of personal brands at HubSpot. We know that we trust humans more than we trust logos. And so personal brands, I think, are a massive part of the content marketing mix today that a lot of marketers are starting to embrace, but it's still pretty wide open. I mean, you can still stand out.
It's still early days. As much as I think you and I have been talking about this, seeing this, practicing it ourselves for 4 or 5 years plus, it's still evolving. And Air Meets and other people are doing some interesting things there. So yeah,
where they're hiring personal brands. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. It's funny being deep in the echo chamber. You think everybody's doing it, but very few companies, I would say, are really focusing on the personal brands inside their company and distributing content that way. So you've got your corporate brand, which is what pretty much every marketer is at least doing that. So they're focusing on the corporate brand. You've got the personal brands, and then you've got this third category that we call a media brand. And so you see what Vidyard, the video email company, has done by building a separate brand that is just for media. It is just for engaging and entertaining sales professionals. And that media brand is SalesFeed. We saw Flip My Funnel was the media brand of Terminus, the ABM platform. And Flip My Funnel is really what allowed Terminus to become the category dominant company for ABM, which was, the tip of every marketer's tongue for almost a decade. And so by creating these separate media brands, you're allowing your content to truly resonate with your buyer without having to try to make that content be optimized for selling your product or service. And so with your corporate brand, obviously the thing you're optimizing for is we want to grow revenue. But with a media brand, you're focused on optimizing for audience, because you know that long term, the larger the audience you have, the more opportunity the more people you're building affinity with, the more opportunity you can monetize that audience later. But it's a longer game strategy. Tyler over at Vidyard did not launch this media brand a year ago and get to 100,000 followers thinking that he was going to convert all 100,000 followers that he accrued over this past year at the snap of a finger. He knows that's not going to happen. Now, is that starting to happen? Yes, but it's a longer game strategy. And I think you're building an asset within your business with the attention that you have through this media brand. And because of the positioning of it, because it's a separate brand, it's a separate website. I think it's exactly what, you saw HubSpot acquire a media brand in The Hustle, and The Hustle is arguably much more influential than even HubSpot's corporate brand, because their corporate brand, obviously folks know that there's somewhat of an agenda there to the content that HubSpot is putting out, because they want you to buy their CRM. But with The Hustle, there's not that. The Hustle can actually monetize itself because it is such good content and has such a big audience that sponsors want to pay to be able to get access to that audience. And so HubSpot is playing that probably a little bit differently than I would. They're putting all of their eggs in promoting HubSpot in now that they've acquired The Hustle. It's all you hear is HubSpot ads or ads for other shows in HubSpot's network, which I don't think is a bad move. I would probably do it a little bit differently, but they're way smarter than me. So who knows? They're probably doing it the right way. But so you have these three motions: your corporate brand, your personal brand, and your media brand. We're all in on helping B2B companies build that media brand, because we just believe that's the future, that every company is becoming a media company. My friend says, he says often, Ben Bradbury over at Workweek says, we say that companies are becoming media companies, but really it's because companies need to become data companies. And when you become a media company, it positions you to truly be a data company, and that data is giving you information and insights about the market that you're trying to serve, that other companies that are not heavily focused on media, they have not earned the ability to be able to collect the kind of data that can give you truly groundbreaking insights.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that too, because one of the things I loved in that Jared's been talking about recently is, the famous line, right? Data is the new oil, right? And now, but what you're talking about here is the power of data is not just contact names and email addresses. You're talking about insights into the market that come from building more consumption and building an audience in a specific niche, and then seeing what do they resonate with? What do they want more of? What questions do they have? What content do they think is crap? How do they talk about that content? All that sort of stuff. And so I just wanted to call that out, because I didn't want people to conflate the two, because I heard that data point, and I know that you're not all about like, oh, it's the data. You're getting more email addresses and that sort of stuff. It is those insights. And so I think there's that through line there. You touched on sales feed. I know you guys have done some content collaborations with Audience Plus and Sangram. And I want to touch on that and how it's evolved for you guys at Sweetfish. It's so weird for me still to say you guys at Sweetfish, by the way, after 4 years on the team. But before we do that, you were talking a little bit in a post here and sometime in the last couple of weeks, at least from when we're recording this on LinkedIn, where you said building a media company or building a media brand, I should say, is a team sport. And I think doubling down on that, what do you mean by that? How do you think about the team? Again, the theme here of the show is marketing together with the rest of your team, with the customers, with partners. So how do you think that plays into the strategy of a media brand? And then we'll talk about partner marketing and stuff like that and how that's evolved and some of the other folks you guys are doing content with.
I think the context of that post, I was talking about I was really talking about an internal team, and I was talking about how shows, so the extension of a media brand that's a show, is I think best done when you have multiple talent hosting that show. So instead of just having one host, have multiple hosts, because if that one host needs to go on vacation or moves on to their next career opportunity, you're not stuck trying to find somebody else. You can continue your cadence of content creation because you've got multiple sources. So for us, for B2B Growth, it's myself, it's Dan Sanchez, and it's Benji Block. We've got 3 different hosts on B2B Growth. And so the other week, I wasn't able to make the recording. I think I have a 16-month-old, so I think he was up half the night, and I couldn't make the recording that next morning. And so Benji and Dan did it without me, and it was a banger of an episode. We've had people talking about it on LinkedIn, sending them direct messages, and so it's really exciting to be a part of something that even when I'm not there, it performs really well. And so that's how it plays internally. But then as we're starting to add new content franchises to B2B Growth, so different series within the show, as we are experimenting with different ways to build media brands. One of the things that I've realized is, and this speaks to the evolution of content-based networking. Before, every single episode we did was an interview with a VP of marketing at a B2B SaaS company. So we were building thousands of relationships, but they were really only skin deep. And so that worked to a certain degree. It allowed us to put out a lot of content. It got us to the point where, we were a top ranked marketing show. But it was, I think it was starting to get a little bit tired. And so when we started shifting and saying, hey, we want to really focus on shining the spotlight on our points of view and our commentary on what's happening in B2B marketing, we started to build a lot more affinity with our audience because we put ourselves back in the driver's seat. We became the talent and really the faces of the show, as opposed to forfeiting that and giving that over to a different guest in every single episode. And so the transition from content-based networking with each episode became content-based networking where we could build deeper relationships with collaborators that we'd bring on for a series. So we're about to launch a new series called Media Brands right now. And now we're not necessarily looking for, just any VP of marketing in a B2B SaaS company, because biz dev was our primary objective before. Well, now we get enough inbound. We don't necessarily need to do biz dev in that way anymore as we've evolved the business, but we do want to talk to these operators, VPs of marketing that are operating media companies inside of their company. And so we reached out to Tyler Lessard. We're doing like a 6 or 8 part series with Tyler on how he's actually operating sales feed inside of Vidyard. And it's been fascinating. Dan and I have been doing the series for the last couple of weeks. We batch record. So now we're doing like 3 different 2-hour phone calls with Tyler. And it's a deep collaboration. We've done calls planning for it. There's going to be probably more calls on how we distribute the content together. But this concept of marketing together is really powerful, because now Tyler Lessard, who is the CMO at Vidyard and the operator of this media brand that's blowing up in the sales community right now, he now has a much deeper relationship with us. He understands our points of view. So as he's talking to his peers, who are other CMOs at companies that are looking to do media, and they're coming to him because he's a practitioner, well, who do you think he's going to refer them to if there's ever, if they're looking for an agency partner that can help them build a media brand, he's likely going to send them our way because we went deep with him. We've had multiple calls with him for this series. And so in a similar way, of how we started content-based networking, which is episode by episode, and really a shotgun approach, trying to bring a lot of people onto the show. We're now we're looking at it from a little bit tighter perspective. And so we're approaching it more with a scalpel and looking at like, okay, what are the topics that one are our own, that align with our own points of view. So this media brand series is a big part of our own point of view. But then what are other series that we can create that would be interesting for our buyers? And who makes the most sense? Who is it? Maybe it's a marketing influencer. Maybe it's somebody who's executing a particular strategy. Who makes the most sense for us to bring them into that series and co-host that series with us? And so we're starting to we're building a creator studio here on the west side of Orlando in the next year to year and a half. But before we do that, we're actually going to be renting a house and turning that into kind of a creator house so that we can build sets and really take the production level to another level. And I'm excited about that because of not just taking the content to another level, but it's going to take our relationships to the next level. So imagine being able to invite Tyler or my friend Jurgen or Camille Trent to Orlando and film for a couple days for a series that we're doing together. You can bet your tail feathers that we're going to have a legitimate friendship by the end of that collaboration, bringing them into the studio, filming with them, planning for it, figuring out how we're going to market it and distribute that content together, is going to be huge for us. So that's been the evolution. It's been from more of a shotgun approach, getting anybody and everybody to be a guest on B2B Growth, to now being way more targeted, but still leveraging the show to build deep relationships with the folks that matter most to us.
Yeah, and I think it reinforces what we were talking about earlier in the relationship building, as well as making the content better at the same time, right? You guys identified someone who is doing the thing, right? I heard this story from Jared recently, being in a room full of marketers. Who do you market to? A bunch of them marketed to CIOs. Well, have you ever been a CIO? No. Okay, then how dare you? How are you going to gain trust with that audience? And so identifying people who sit in that seat, but it's evolved, right? As you said, as opposed to stacking a bunch of those thousands of relationships skin deep, going deeper with folks who are doing the thing. In your case, it's Vidyard who's building a media brand in SalesFeed. How can we collaborate there? It gives you a different level of trust, one, right? But to your point, it's still relationship building. It's not on the same mass scale, but actually it may have an even bigger impact, right? Because those strategic relationships can outweigh many, smaller relationships, not to discount that. Depending on you and your market and what your goals are and all those sorts of things, building relationships at massive scale or building a few key strategic relationships in marketing with those folks, either one could be the right play for you, depending on where the evolution and what your goals are. So for folks who are thinking, okay, who should I think about marketing with? You identified one. Who's doing the thing that you're talking about? The other is, who else is singing a similar tune? Who's beating a similar drum beat? And for you guys, I think that has been some collaborations with the folks at Audience Plus, because they're talking about getting off of rented land, and that involves a media brand strategy. So tell me a little bit about what have been some of the lessons learned in not just marketing with people who are doing the thing that you're talking about, but the other people who are singing the same tune as you are.
Yeah. So it's folks that are singing the same tune as you that also have influence with your buyers. And so it's funny, I told the story about Anthony earlier. While he was at Gainsight, he's now gone on to start his own company, and he asked me to co-host a show with him called Owned. And I came up with the premise of this show because of a friend of ours, Jay Akunzo, who developed something very similar. We were going to do a show where we broke down the B2B media brands. And we knew it was going to be a short-lived show because there's not very many B2B media brands right now. But when I started talking to Anthony about potentially doing a show with him, I was like, well, what if we broke down consumer media brands? And it made a lot of sense. There's obviously an endless number of consumer media brands. And so, so that made a lot of sense because, again, our buyers, VPs of marketing, CMOs at B2B SaaS companies, are looking at what Anthony's doing with Audience Plus, and they're aligning with that vision. And so because Anthony and I have a shared vision of media is the way, every company is becoming a media company, the more I can do with Anthony, the better. And so Owned is not our show. We came up with the name and the premise, but it's Anthony and the Audience Plus team that's producing that show, that owns that show. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not owning that property because it puts me in front of a completely different audience than the audience that I'm fortunate to be able to access through B2B growth, day in and day out. And so I think collaborations like that, where you get an opportunity to co-host a show on a regular basis. I ended up going to Phoenix and recording some content in person with Anthony a few weeks ago. We ended up going to a Suns Lakers game. I now text back and forth with him about how his kids are doing on a very regular basis. And to me, that's what brings so much joy to business for me is the actual building of legitimate friendships. Do I want business results? Of course, but I'm trying to optimize my life for actually loving life. And if I can use business as a platform to be able to build friendships, then that's going to make my life better. And so that's why I think this concept of marketing together, it's so much bigger than just like trying to drive results for your business. I think it brings a level of joy to life that I think is really, really special.
I'm so glad you came back to that, man, because it's one of the things that, as we gave a little bit of the peak of part of our story, that's a whole other podcast episode of our journey together. But I remember being on LinkedIn and you had a post where you were going out and visiting a Sweetfish customer or something like, I can't believe I get to do this for work now or something like that. And it was that joy that I saw in you that was like, okay, I want to get to know James more. I want to get to work with him. And that led to a great 4-year run of me being on the Sweetfish team. So that was good. And the last thing, man, I just want to circle around here because you touched on something that I think there are a few things that you do very naturally that actually I hadn't even planned on asking you, but you touched on it there and just texting and different things that you've done to follow up and be creative. And be intentional about relationship building. So often, especially in B2B, we're like, oh, I got a sponsor or we're doing this content collaboration. The campaign is over, right? But I think that you continually, through your personality and also just through the approach that you intentionally take, are intentional about building relationships with those partners, with those customers, with those collaborators. What are maybe 2 or 3 things you recommend to folks if you're marketing with folks? What are 3 ways you could maybe build relationships with them, stay connected that maybe most people in B2B aren't doing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that this is going to be groundbreaking and might cause some eye rolls, but I think getting on a plane and going and breaking bread with somebody is, it's a classic way to do it. For me, I figured out like, hey, I'm trying to visit every baseball park in the country. So do they live in a city of a ballpark that I haven't been to? And maybe I have been there, but it's like, hey, let's go see a Cardinals game in St. Louis. I haven't been to that ballpark. Would love to take you. And I think what I love about baseball games as a relationship builder, it's like 3 hours of watching a relatively boring game, if we're all honest. Like baseball is not exciting to watch, but you can sit and just talk with somebody. I did this with Chris Orlob, who was formerly at Gong. He was at Gong at the time, and I took him to a Giants game, And we ended up just jamming for 3 hours while the Giants happened to be playing in the background on the freaking bay. Now Chris and I have a relationship because of something we did 3 years ago, spending that kind of chunk of time together. There are other things that you can do. I would organize little dinners in different pockets of the country and then invite a bunch of people that had been on B2B Growth to go to dinner. So we did Boston and Austin and San Francisco, and we went to a bunch of different cities and did those kind of dinners. But I think like in person is a great way to accelerate it. Another one is just being attentive to what people are saying, and like, did they mention something about their kid? Did they mention something that they've got going on this weekend? Jotting that down and then being creative in some gifting. So one way to kind of elicit that is try opening your calls by talking about something more personal. So if I open my call, I'm like, oh man, my 16-month-old was up until 4 a.m. and I wasn't able to go back to bed till 4:45. So if I'm a little bit groggy this morning, that's why. By opening up that way, you're going to, like, if there's something relatable there, it's like, oh, I have a newborn too, or, oh yeah, I remember when my 7-year-old was at like trying to figure out how to connect on a more human level is I think a smart way to go about it. You have to lead with that kind of, I don't necessarily call it vulnerability, but like that kind of openness about who you are when your work hat's not on, and it will elicit other people telling you about their, what Alice calls their 5 to 9.
Yeah, exactly. I love the way that they say that. Yeah. And I think it's just not even necessarily vulnerability, but somewhat transparency. I guess a little bit more transparent doesn't mean everything there. But I mean, those are some good tips. I know we've been talking about content-based networking, how marketing together has evolved over time, but I appreciate you taking a few more minutes just to give some tips for folks, because I think we do get so set on, okay, co-marketing looks like this. We kick off a campaign, we do the webinar together. But I think some of those things, where's there an opportunity for a shared in-person experience? Where can you share a meal? There's power in breaking bread together. I think we all get that. And then the personal touches.
Yeah. And put a reminder in your phone. Like if I heard Logan talking about his 12-year-old is super into Legos, like put a reminder in your phone right there on the spot to like, hey, like send Logan a Lego set of, the new Star Wars movie that just came out or whatever. Like use reminders and then set recurring reminders. So like, is there somebody that you're like, man, I just had a really good connection with them? Hop off the call and then just like, hey, every 30 days, put a reminder in your phone to ping this person and ask them how they're doing. The other hack to this is try to get cell phone numbers. The quicker that you can get somebody into a text thread as opposed to email, the more personal, the more affinity you're going to be able to build with that person. So it's another little nuance, but I always try to get folks texting me instead of emailing. And the way you can do that is like, hey, my inbox is a freaking nightmare. Here's my number. Would you mind texting me real quick so I can have your number in my phone? So particularly if you're doing some sort of event or collaboration together, like getting their phone number makes a whole lot of sense. Cause it's like, hey, if something goes awry, like my email is going to be wacky.
Yeah, when we're on site, that sort of thing. And also, like, even though most of the people listening to this are not in sales, like we all have HubSpot meetings or Chili Piper or Calendly these days. Make the cell phone number and at least an optional field when people are booking with you. And let's say you have that first call. Hey, we're going to do a series together. We're going to do some sort of co-marketing. Send them a text and just be like, hey, that was a great call. That's another way to kind of, not in a creepy way, slide into their DMs and slide into their text thread.
Or send them a funny GIF. Like,
right.
Like,
Just, that was awesome.
Yeah.
Right. And nothing else. It just opens that door. So, for everybody listening to this, thank you for hanging on for a little bit longer on this episode. Cause I think there were some things there. Cause even as much, the name of this show is Marketing Together. We're talking about how do you market together? I think even in the midst of that, we can still focus so much on the marketing and forget the together piece, even though it's the name of the show. And so I think that the last 5-10 minutes of James and I jamming on how can you create those connections together, whether you're partnering with your internal team, with your partners, with your customers, with your prospects, with other industry influencers, it comes down to those personal connections. Well, speaking of connecting, James, as we rounded out, what's the best way for people to connect with you and stay up to date and in the loop with what you and the Sweetfish crew are up to?
Yeah, so you can follow B2B Growth wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening, so you can keep up to date with what we're doing. I'm very active on LinkedIn, so James Carbary, Carbary on LinkedIn, or you can shoot me an email, james@sweetfishmedia.com. Would love to connect with anybody that listens to this and wants to jam on something.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for the time today. And thank you for listening. And remember, we go further faster when we're marketing together.